I've spent a lot of time in the swamps, more than most people would consider reasonable, honestly. I grew up in Southern Louisiana, right on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, and from the time I was about 13, I was out there on my own, fishing, trapping, just wandering. People hear that and they picture some reckless kid who didn't know any better. But that's the thing. I did know better. I'd grown up learning every sound that place made, every way the water moved, every animal that called it home. I understood the risks in the way that only comes from years of small mistakes that didn't kill you. And none of that, not one single thing I'd learned out there, prepared me for what I've experienced in those woods. I'm going to tell you three of them, in order, because I think the order matters. The first time something really rattled me, I was 19. A buddy of mine dropped me off at a put-in point out past Butte La Rose, and I was solo paddling a route I'd run maybe a dozen times before. It was October, so the water was low and still, and the air had finally broken from the summer heat enough to actually be pleasant out there. I remember the light that afternoon being almost amber, everything gold and slow, the kind of afternoon that makes you feel like the world is doing you a favor just by existing. I set up a small camp on a raised piece of ground between two cypress stands, maybe 6 feet above the water line, which out there is basically a mountain. I cooked some rice and sausage on a little backpacking stove, ate slow, watched the herons working the shallows about 50 yards out. The frogs started up around dusk the way they always do, loud, layered, almost rhythmic. It's one of my favorite sounds in the world, that frog chorus. It means everything is normal. Everything is in its right place. I crawled into my tent, feeling genuinely good about life. Somewhere around 9, maybe 9:30, the frogs stopped. Not gradually, the way sound fades. Just off. One moment the whole basin was singing, and the next moment there was nothing. I'd heard that happen before when a big gator pushes through an area. The frogs go quiet, wait for it to pass, then start back up. So I lay there and I waited, and I waited. 20 minutes went by, then 30, then I stopped counting. I can't overstate how wrong the silence felt. Not peaceful, not the silence of a sleeping place, the kind of silence that makes you feel like something has been removed from the air itself. I told myself it was a gator, a big one, maybe 2 of them, and the frogs were just being cautious. I told myself this very deliberately, the way you talk yourself down off something, and for a few minutes, it worked. I felt my shoulders drop. I let out a slow breath. And then I heard it, something moving around the perimeter of my camp, not in the water, on the ground, on my little 6 foot above waterline patch of solid earth. It was moving through the leaf litter and the root tangles with a kind of weight that small animals don't have, and it was moving on 2 points of contact, not 4, 2, slow and deliberate like it was in no particular hurry. I tracked the sound as it made a full circle around my tent, one full, unbroken circle, and then it stopped, right back where it had started, and the sound just faded out, not like it walked away, more like the sound lost interest. I lay there until gray light came through the tent fabric. I didn't sleep. I barely blinked. When I finally unzipped and walked the perimeter myself, there was nothing. No tracks in the soft ground, no disturbed root systems, no signs of anything having been there at all. The frogs started back up right around first light like someone had flipped a switch. I paddled out that morning and didn't tell anyone about it for almost a year, because I didn't have a single word to offer for what I'd heard. The second experience was about 4 years later, and this one I didn't go through alone, which should make me feel better about it. It doesn't. I was out with my cousin Darnell. This is a man who has been in and around that basin his entire life, who once stayed calm when a cottonmouth dropped into our boat from an overhanging branch, who I have genuinely never seen panic about anything. That matters for what I'm about to tell you. We were running a gill net along a slough off the main channel, a spot Darnell had fished since he was maybe 8 years old. Broad daylight, 2 in the afternoon, maybe a little after. The sky was high and blue, and there was a decent breeze keeping the bugs manageable. Everything about the situation was ordinary. We'd anchored up and were working the net when Darnell just went still. Not like he heard something. More like he saw something, and his whole body decided to stop before his brain gave the instruction. I looked up and followed his line of sight to the opposite bank. 40 feet of open water, then a dense wall of cypress with Spanish moss hanging low enough in places to touch the surface, shadow and green and gray. I looked for maybe 5 seconds and saw nothing, and then I did. There was something at the tree line, standing, just standing there in the gap between two of the bigger trunks. It was tall, or it read as tall, though the moss and shadow made scale almost impossible to judge. It wasn't moving. We weren't moving. The net was hanging between us, half checked, and neither of us touched it. Darnell said very quietly, not quite a whisper. You see that? It wasn't a question, and I said yeah. We watched it for what felt like 3 minutes, maybe more. My brain kept trying to file it somewhere. Deer, bear, guy in dark clothes who wandered off a hunting lease, and it kept failing. The shape didn't resolve into anything I recognized. The proportions were wrong in a way I couldn't pin down specifically. The longer I looked, the less certain I became of what I was even looking at. And then a little breeze came through and moved the moss, and whatever I'd been looking at was just gone. Not like it stepped back into the trees. Gone the way a reflection disappears when the water moves. Darnell pulled the net in without saying a word. We ran back to the launch in silence. I've tried to bring it up with him twice since then, and both times he just shakes his head slowly and looks somewhere else. Darnell is not a man who avoids things. The fact that he won't touch this one is the detail I keep coming back to, late at night, when I'm lying still and the house is quiet. The last one happened 3 winters ago, and it's the one that changed how I move through that place. Permanently. I was deeper in than I usually go alone, following up a tip from an older Cajun guy I'd fished with a few times about a productive hole about 2 miles off the nearest road. He described it well, and I found it without much trouble, and he was right. It was good. I spent most of the day out there, lost track of time the way you do when the fishing is actually working. Around 4, I looked up and realized how low the light had gotten. I should have started back an hour earlier. I knew that. I knew it the way you know something and choose not to act on it because everything feels fine in the moment. That's on me. I packed up fast and started moving. I was already walking quickly, trying to calculate whether I had enough light to make it out clean, when I noticed the tree. Big live oak, older than anything nearby, sitting just off the edge of my route home. Live oaks out there aren't rare, but they stand out. Different shape, different texture than the cypress. This one had been marked, not a hunter's blaze. Something had cut into the bark deeply and deliberately. A series of lines arranged in a pattern I couldn't read in the fading light. Vertical lines, horizontal lines, grouped in a way that felt almost like it meant something. I stood and looked at it for maybe 30 seconds, and something clicked. Not a thought exactly, more like a signal my body sent out before my brain had finished processing. I turned away from the tree and I started moving again, faster than before. I heard it about 2 minutes later, behind me and to the left, just inside the tree line. A sound I have tried to describe to exactly 3 people in my life and failed every time. It was low. It was rhythmic. It had a regularity to it that felt almost mechanical, except it wasn't. There was something organic in the texture of it, something that made the hair on my forearms stand up in a way that cold air alone doesn't cause. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't any animal call I'd ever heard, and I've heard most of them. It just kept going steady and low, and it stayed at roughly the same distance behind me no matter how fast I moved. I did not look back. I want to be clear about that. Whatever was in me that night, instinct, fear, something older than either, it told me with absolute certainty not to look back. I moved through that swamp faster than I've ever moved in my life, through water and mud and root tangles in the near dark, and when I finally hit the gravel road, I just kept going until I reached my truck. I got in, I locked the doors, I sat there with the engine running and the heater on, and I stared at the tree line for a long time. My hands weren't shaking. That's the part I still find strange. I wasn't in shock. I wasn't crying. I wasn't doing any of the things people do in movies after something like that. I just sat there with this very deep, very settled feeling that I had come extremely close to something I was not supposed to encounter. Like I had walked up to the edge of something, and the only reason I was sitting in that truck was because I had turned around before I saw what was on the other side. I drove home. I didn't call anyone. I didn't file a report. File a report for what exactly? I slept about 2 hours that night and was awake before dawn, just sitting in my kitchen. I still go back out there. I'm not going to pretend the swamp isn't
The
still part
swamp
of
will
me,
tell
because
you
it is. But I go
when it's
earlier
done
now.
with you.
I come back with daylight to spare, and whenever the woods go quiet, really quiet, that held breath kind of quiet, I don't wait around to find out why. That's the only thing those three experiences ever gave me that I'd call useful. The swamp will tell you when it's done with you for the day. The ones who don't make it back are the ones who didn't listen. I listened, eventually.